Chapter 20, Convergence. Are they becoming more like us? I believe we can save her Russia by trade. Commerce has a sobering influence. Trade, in my opinion, will bring an end to the ferocity, the rapine, and the crudity of Bolshevism surer than any other method. British Prime Minister Lloyd George, February 10th, 1922. Like a snowfall that commences with a few uncertain flakes, thickens gradually into flurries, and then becomes a blizzard. The word that the Soviet government had stopped unacknowledged jamming of the broadcast of the Voice of America, the BBC, and the West German radio spread to the Russian people. It was mid-September 1973. A few days later we visited the apartment of some Russian friends, people who had long since evolved the intricate arrangements for obtaining jeans and French perfumes from abroad, for putting Western paperbacks on their bookshelves, and getting a Beatles poster for their kitchen wall. Their 10-year-old son, Vasya, drifted into the sitting room with a transistor pressed to his ear, his brown eyes aglow and a satisfied grin on his face. He's been like that for the last few days, going around everywhere with his transistor, listening to the Voice of America, his mother explained. We all have. Another friend, a computer specialist, told me that in his research institute some of the staff were assembled for a political lecture about Andrei Sakharov by a Communist Party propagandist. After his opening talk, someone asked the party official to tell precisely what Sakharov had said, since none of his works or statements had been published in the Soviet press. Without hesitation, the lecturer replied, "Maybe someone has been listening to the foreign radio broadcast and can tell us what they say about Sakharov." No one took up his offer. But it was a striking example of the overnight change that had taken place. Not that some people had not been listening furtively to Western radio stations all along. Within weeks of my arrival in the Soviet Union, I had been ushered into a cramped walk-down apartment in Kishinev, the capital of Soviet Moldavia, and behind drawn shades I'd watched a couple work the dials of a bulky old-fashioned shortwave cabinet radio on spindly legs. In the Siberian city of Bratsk, I had been taken to see the amazing library of Western rock recordings compiled from Voice of America transmissions by a young pop group. They could not really understand English, but they mimicked the mellow-toned disc jockeys. This is Willis Conover bringing you Music USA, and broke into laughter. Walking or picnicking in the woods around Moscow, staying in their country cottages, or living in the smaller cities and towns from the Carpathian mountains of Belarusia to the Pacific Far East, Soviet people had been discreetly tuning in to foreign stations for years, but in big cities, jamming had made it not only difficult but risky. Now, suddenly, with the jamming halted, people could not only listen, but also admit to each other that they had done so. The young could quite brashly make cassette recordings from the foreign pop music shows and then swap or sell them. At work, their parents could openly share the latest reports on the Arab-Israeli fighting in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. For the first time, the middle-aged computer specialist said to me he felt personally affected by detente. Of course, he had been relieved by the improvement in Soviet-American relations. Because everyone wants peace, he said. but until the jamming ended, he had felt that détente had been for the big bosses and not for us. It was vignettes like those reported in the Western press and brought home by Western tourists or visiting business delegations that reawakened the two perennial and irresistible questions: are they becoming more like us? Has life inside Russia changed? Is it being liberalized? These are natural enough assumptions. I'd leaned toward them myself when I left Moscow. With the instant radio communications of the 20th century, constant world travel, broadening trade, and the declaration of East-West détente, we tend to assume that the world is becoming more homogeneous, a global village. It seems almost axiomatic that if leaders east and west get along better and ordinary people fly similar jets, land at similar airports, ride cars, wear suits and ties, or platform shoes and jeans, launch their astronauts into space, build atomic power plants, turn over their problems to computers, and find their young people keeping time to a common rock beat, that the ways of life under capitalism and communism are growing similar. Scholars have coined a name for it: convergence, the comforting and tempting thesis that the mass production, vast-scale, complex organization, and modern technology of today's economies will impel them along similar paths. Economic and political systems, so the theory goes, converge because they must cope with the same kinds of problems and naturally tend to evolve similar techniques and institutions. At almost every turn of Soviet life, of Soviet history, since the death of Stalin, we in the West, and many in Russia itself, have sought confirmation for the hope that the harsh totalitarianism built by Stalin was eroding. Khrushchev's stark condemnations of Stalinist terror in 1956 and 1961 seemed at the time to have demolished the myth of the Communist Party's infallibility. Russians thought, some in hope and others in panic, that its unchallenged supremacy over Soviet life would never again be the same. The cultural ferment of the Khrushchev Thaw, the first flowering of Yevtushenko, Voznesensky, Zelensyn, and others, appeared to put liberalization of Soviet culture and intellectual life on a new, promising, and seemingly irreversible course. In the 50s, the West encouraged this trend by developing cultural exchanges with Moscow. We were astonished and sanguine when Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago was published abroad. True, he was vilified, forced to renounce the Nobel Prize, and left to die in solitude, but he had not been liquidated as he surely would have been under Stalin. The liberalization seemed to strengthen in the mid-60s when hundreds of scientists and other liberal intellectuals, some of them Communist Party members, risked putting their names to written protest against the trial of writers like Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel, who had smuggled out their writings to the West and were being punished by Khrushchev's successors. When that phase of letter protest faded and retrenchment followed, more sober heads reasoned that the education of a generation of engineers, technocrats, and computer specialists was bound to dilute the influence of ideology and bring economic and political reforms. Finally, there was détente, the formal acknowledgement of strategic stalemate, accompanied by Moscow's decision to seek trade with the capitalist it had so long maligned. Once again, it seemed that the Soviet system was undergoing fundamental change. So many are the hidden undercurrents of Soviet life, and so frequently flowing in opposite directions. that no outsider can be confident of knowing whither goes Soviet Russia, but some forces of change are visible, and some changes have clearly taken place. Most dramatically, of course, Stalin's arbitrary, lunatic mass terror that irrationally decimated the top ranks of the Communist Party and the military high command, as well as eliminating millions of ordinary citizens, has been halted. Khrushchev did that, and though the memory of Stalinist terror and its legacy remain, for most Russians today, the sense of liberation from the unrelieved uncertainty of the Stalinist purges is a vital fact of life. Once, as I was coming out of our foreigner's apartment ghetto with two young couples who had been courageous enough to enter past the secret police guards at the gate, one young man heaved a sigh of relief and confessed, "If it had been under Stalin, I would never have dared try that. We would have been finished." Whether they entirely escaped without retribution in Brezhnev's Russia, I'll never know, because I was unable to make contact with them again, but I am confident that even if discovered, they were not as harshly punished as they would have been under Stalin. Almost equally important, it seemed to some Russians I knew, has been the radical improvement in Soviet living standards since the death of Stalin. Under the dictator, they had literally been bled white and denied decent food, housing, and clothing. They had been squeezed to the utmost as a corvée workforce for national construction. Now in the 70s, they are enjoying what is materially the best decade of Soviet history. They are still poorly off by the standards of the industrialized West, and they have to endure a shopping gauntlet that would wither the will of a weaker race. But their only real standard of comparison is the past, and as many Russians said to me, they are grateful for how much better off we are than our parents. What is more, among the upper middle class of intellectuals, administrators, engineers, writers, ballerinas, the officially sanctioned consumerism has let loose acquisitive burgess instincts that Russians had been suppressing for decades. In the private car, the privately owned apartment, the private country dacha, no matter if it is no bigger than a tool shed, they have found a niche of life independent from all-embracing collectivism. The very fact of ownership has generated an appetite for more and has sharpened dissatisfaction with the poor quality of Soviet consumer goods and services. It has also given new impetus to the black market, the entire counter-economy that has become a fixture of the Soviet system. The new materialism, just as older, more orthodox communist feared, has contributed to the erosion of the communist ideology. Everyone pays lip service to the party slogans, yet I do not recall, in 3 years of living in Moscow, hearing anyone convincingly echo the sentiments of Yevgenia Ginsburg, an idealistic Bolshevik revolutionary jailed by Stalin, who remembered her youth thus, "I don't want to sound pretentious, but quite honestly, had I been ordered to die for the party not once but 3 times, I would have obeyed without a moment's hesitation." That was 4 decades ago. Today, such zeal is not to be found, nor is it essential. What matters is the facade of political conformity. For the party, alert to the ebbing of ideological conviction, insist nonetheless on a show of faith and young ambitious careerists comply, whatever their private thoughts, because they have learned that party membership is a ticket to a good job, a comfortable life, and maybe a chance to travel abroad. Probably the greatest as yet unrealized force for change within the Soviet system is the impulse for major economic reform, quite apart from the few outspoken dissenters who advocate an open, multi-party democratic political system. There exists a sizable latent, loyal opposition within the economic establishment, a strata of managers and technocrats worried about what they deplore as the stagnation of the Soviet economy. These are people content to keep the political structure, but who want to modernize the economy, make it operate more rationally, and with less interference from the party high command and the central planners. One group of modern-minded mathematical economists has challenged the highly centralized planning inherited from Stalin, with its rigid production targets to be implemented at all costs, and has pushed for a more flexible approach. In the mid-60s, Prime Minister Khrushchev promoted some economic decentralization and experimented with using profits and sales rather than sheer volume of output as a gauge of economic success. Other, more limited experiments in economic pragmatism were tried in agriculture and construction to try to increase productivity. A parallel drive to turn away from ideology and toward greater realism that has intrigued Western scholars has been the development of Soviet sociology since the late 50s, a trend that saw several Soviet sociologists chip away at Marxist shibboleths. Brezhnev, for example, might boast that with each victorious year, Soviet society was becoming more classless, and distinctions between white and blue-collar labor were disappearing. But sociological studies began showing the opposite. Actually, sociology had some tender beginnings in the Soviet 20s until Stalin prescribed it officially as anti-Marxist. Until 1958, it remained almost non-existent, at best a very weak stepchild of economics and philosophy. It was not taught as a separate discipline because its empirical methods were an implicit challenge to Marxist-Leninist ideology and the party's monopoly on social information. Sociology got its real start in the late 50s as part of the general intellectual ferment of the Khrushchev era. Even some moderate Communist Party figures saw it as a modern tool for managing society and encouraged it. By the mid-60s, some sociologists were optimistically toying with the idea of venturing into political science as an empirical academic discipline, apart from established, heavily ideological courses in Marxism-Leninism. By 1968, the Institute for Applied Social Research had been set up in Moscow and was said to be doing some secret research for the party and the military, but long before then, and more striking actually, was the appearance of field studies that had begun to show that Soviet society was becoming more stratified, not more classless, as Brezhnev claimed, that it was getting harder for blue-collar working-class children to move up the social ladder, that, in spite of all the propaganda about the land of the victorious proletariat and the high esteem for physical labor, young people from all social classes looked down on blue-collar jobs and aspired to be physicists, engineers, medical scientists, mathematicians, chemists, or radio specialists. One study revealed that the offspring of the intelligentsia had at least 8 times as good a chance of getting into university as farm children, and Western scholars extrapolating from that data reckon the odds as possibly 24 to 1. Some sociologists began to report that blue-collar workers were alienated from their factory jobs, theoretically impossible according to Soviet dogma, since alienation was supposed to be the result of the capitalist system of ownership. Other scholars began studying the sociology of religious beliefs and practices. Still, others showed that young people were interested in material well-being, satisfying careers, or foreign travel, and were turned off by political indoctrination. These were all limited studies, done in one small region or another, because Soviet sociologists had and still have no known capability for national opinion polling. Often the findings were printed in limited circulation academic journals and obscured in charts, but the implications were there to be seen. Moreover, theorists began to formulate concepts for Soviet sociology that were closely related to Western theories. The whole phenomenon was followed with hopeful approval by a knowledgeable segment of the liberal intelligentsia who regarded the development of sociology and the empirical facts it was turning up about Soviet life as a touchstone for liberalization and an important avenue toward eventual reforms. But in 1971, the clock was turned back, and empirical sociology was put on the defensive. Like other areas of Soviet intellectual life, it was hit by the backlash over Czechoslovak liberalism, by the conservative Soviet reflex against revisionist thinking and liberalization at home, and the general crackdown against intellectuals, especially Jews, who had been signing protest petitions in the earlier ferment of the mid and late 60s. There were too many inquisitive minds at work, and they, the authorities, decided they had to muzzle them. I was told by Sasha, a dark-haired young Soviet sociologist. We met in an ill-lit room of a communal apartment in downtown Moscow. Sasha was nervous about meeting an American correspondent, but anxious to tell the story of the purge at the Institute of Applied Social Research in Moscow, by far the most important such center in the country. Investigating commissions set up by the party in late 1971 and 72 questioned staff members and announced their intention to weed out the bad apples. He said the director was forced into retirement, and by Sasha's count, about 1/3 of the 300 professional sociologists were purged, including the most daring and dynamic researchers who fled to institutes of other disciplines. Conservatives then put on pressure to expunge Western concepts and terminology. The new institute director, Emin Rukovich, sounded a stern note by reasserting the primacy of Marxist-Leninist ideology and party control. Sociology is a party science. Rukovich declared in Pravda in September 1973, the Marxist sociologist, be he scientist, party official, or economic official, cannot pose as an impartial researcher. The purge at the Moscow Institute was a major setback for sociology nationally, because that institute had collected many of the best researchers and had played a central role in the field. Publication of new work dropped off. Sociologists were split up and felt they had to lay low. I tried to meet with several of them, but all except Sasha were too scared to take that risk. It's a bad situation for the development of sociology, Sasha said. People feel isolated. Still, to regain some international standing, Soviet sociology was allowed to recover organizationally. In the fall of '74, a regular sociological journal appeared for the first time, and the Moscow Institute was renamed the Institute for Sociological Research, a step forward. A new batch of research studies appeared, but Western sociologists were unimpressed with them. Though sometimes more carefully done than the work of the '60s, the new work seemed more limited in scope, more cautious, and generally less revealing. Word passed that the best research was being kept secret, unpublished, while publicly of Soviet sociology became more ideologically conservative. It faced an uncertain future. Other Soviet intellectuals were disheartened. "It's a shame," said a physicist disconsolately. "They are doing narrower studies now. It's too bad, not only for them, but also for the rest of us." The fate of Soviet sociology tells a lot about the political temper of Brezhnev's Russia. First, the pattern of early experimentation and later retrenchment, and second, the watershed for Soviet internal life that was the result of the Kremlin's decision to invade Czechoslovakia in August of '68, to crush the liberal reforms there. The liberal Russians I knew regarded the Soviet '70s under Brezhnev as a period of gray, stand-pat conservatism at home, a less venturesome, stimulating, promising time than in the reign of Khrushchev. The Brezhnev era has brought the partial rehabilitation of Stalin and the suppression of Khrushchev's criticism of Stalinist terror, a shift of great symbolic importance to all Russians. For Westerners to comprehend what this means, they would have to imagine that in America, for example, it became impossible to write or talk openly about the Vietnam War, the Watergate Scandal, the whole controversy over the domestic political activities of the CIA and FBI. As Russians remarked to me, when the dark side of history is shut off, it darkens the present as well. Not only was the past placed beyond criticism, but a campaign of repression was directed against intellectual dissidents to curtail the ferment that Khrushchev's Thaw had released. In the late '60s, the drive seemed to focus against the scientists and other scholars who had participated in the letter protest. Enough of them were expelled from the party, pressured or fired from jobs, and permanently blacklisted to force establishment liberals to retreat from direct, open criticism. In the early '70s, despite détente, there was a sharper crackdown against active dissidents, the deportation of Solzhenitsyn, the effective isolation of Sakharov, a campaign to suppress underground publications, and to jail nationalists in the Ukraine, Lithuania, Armenia, and elsewhere, and continuing trials and exile to Siberia or abroad of less well-known dissenters. In the wider cultural world as well, there was a reflexive tightening that squeezed off the hopes spawned under Khrushchev for steady cultural liberalization and freer expression. By 1970 to '71, its effects were fairly clear. After that, several published writers complained to me works that had gotten into print in the Khrushchev era and the early Brezhnev years were no longer printable. Under Khrushchev, our literature was better. One novelist advised me it was easier to breathe then. In New World magazine, you could read real literature, Solzhenitsyn, Dudinstev, others. Now Solzhenitsyn is gone, and you can't read Dudinstev. Others thought, however, that the theater had become more active and interesting, but even they acknowledged that while individual films, plays, or books might stir temporary interest, the Brezhnev period had choked off the sense of ferment, direction, and hope of the Khrushchev Thaw. The real measure of the cultural claustrophobia was that in a country that has historically issued forth a volcanic flow of creative talent, no writer of real stature has emerged publicly since Solzhenitsyn and Pasternak. Conservatives obstructed change in other fields as well. The economic reforms intended by Kostyan in the mid-60s to give industrial managers more incentives and more flexibility were gutted and smothered by the powerful party and government bureaucracies in Moscow. Central planners fought off proposals of mathematical economists for more flexible planning. In agriculture, the experiment with the farming link groups was sidetracked and effectively abandoned. In short, despite the fascinating eccentricities of Russian life beneath the surface, most of the basic economic and political structure inherited from Stalin remains intact today. In spite of the political earth tremors caused by Khrushchev, the dominance and infallibility of the Communist Party are still the pillars of the Soviet edifice. Any small organization, even a club of dog lovers or cactus growers, is supervised by some appropriate body of the party, groused Roy Medvedev, the dissident historian. Within the party, there has been precious little new blood at or near the top. Khrushchev's plan for enforced rotation of choice party jobs has been scrapped. The leadership has become conservative with age. The average age of the Politburo in 1975 was 66, and so have the echelons of bureaucrats beneath it. The bloody purges have ended, but not the system of coercion with its Siberian camps and secret police. Occasionally criticized in Khrushchev's time, the secret police have been restored to respectability and are now even lauded by the press as our brave Chekists. Lenin's name for them. Yuri Andropov, the head of the KGB, was elevated into the Politburo in April of '73, the first time since Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's secret police chief, enjoyed such rank, and while it is a vital fact of Soviet life that Stalin's control by mass terror has been abandoned, it is also true that more subtle techniques of repression seem quite adequate. Stalin's overkill has been streamlined. As one dissident observed, the regime has found that several thousand selected arrests and blacklistings have a chilling effect and that mass terror is not necessary. People are cautious, not so much from fear of being thrown in prison, a movie script writer confessed, but because of more subtle pressures, jobs, travel, little privileges, and opportunities. The system works quietly, nor has there been any automatic cause and effect, as many in the West presumed, between economic improvements and the development of political democracy and liberalization in Soviet life. In time, the rising expectations of Soviet consumers and the emergence of a self-conscious middle class may affect the Soviet system, but so far the burgeoning of Burgess taste has not forced any realignment of national priorities or shifts of power. Publicly, the Brezhnev coalition has made a great show of attentiveness to consumers, and Soviet consumers are unquestionably better off. After the meat riots by Polish dock workers in the Baltic seaports in December of 1970, the Kremlin was sufficiently shaken to promise the Soviet people the first five-year plan in their history, 1971 through 5, that would strive for more growth in the consumer sector than in heavy industry. But in 1972, the priorities had been quietly reversed, and by 74, the Soviet leadership was openly admitting that top priority was again going to heavy industry. In other countries, such a shift might have been risky, but one distinguishing feature of Russian life is the leadership's ability to hold consumer expectations in check. Paul Hollander, an American sociologist, made the shrewd observation that the Soviet people have been told of approaching utopia for over 50 years, and yet there has been no appreciable growth of a utopian mentality among them. The regime has failed to make good on all kinds of promises, yet Russian consumers are appeased if there is a steady supply of bread, cabbage, potatoes, and vodka, an occasional shipment of oranges, and a chance once in a while to go to a Western movie. They will settle for less than consumers in any other industrialized nation, and that is an important element of the regime's stability. What is more, the very mood of consumer materialism among Soviet intellectuals seems to have sapped their energy for reform and diverted their urge for a freer cultural and political climate. The earlier idealism of the Khrushchev period has given way to a cynical mood. Cynicism, observed a disillusioned mathematician, is the ultimate method of control. People are on the make for themselves and care little about broader social issues, echoed a highly placed party journalist. The Nashalstvo, the class of bosses, and the cultural and scientific elite enjoy their covert creature comforts, and those just beneath them lust after the same privileges. A surprising number of intellectuals are corrosively disaffected, judging by their private remarks to me, but feel impotent and prefer escape into their private lives to jousting with the system. Not long before I left Moscow, Yevgeny Yevtunchenko caught the mood in a little poem that mocked the way that liberal writers, himself included I presume, were being tamed by the trappings of affluence into toning down their works. That internal villain of self-censorship, Kompromis Kompromisovich, he said, whispers from within, well, don't you be too choosy, alter a line a bit, calculating everything with an abacus. This recruiter of compromises buys us off with things like big children. He buys us off with flats, furniture, showy fashions, and we're no longer belligerent. We raise a noise only when we are drinking. You have to understand that we are years behind you in the West, a magazine editor mused. Right now, I suppose, we are about where you Americans were after the war, when you were gorging yourselves on the material things that you had been denied during the war: cars, houses, clothes. There was no radical political movement in America then, no hint of what was to come 20 years later, though the intellectual dropouts from your society now owe something to those and that time. So right now there is a rush in our society to get dashas, cars, and I don't know what. People are talking about these things, not caring about anything else. But maybe after a while people will have enough of these material things and they will start thinking more about the quality of life. Maybe in a generation or two. That was a phrase I heard rather frequently. Maybe in a generation or two, the Russian sense of time is so different from that in the West, so much more patient, and Russians, unlike Americans and other Westerners, do not assume that progress toward a more liberal, open society is inevitable. Even so, détente has had an impact on the Soviet scene. Without détente, for example, it would have been impossible for an American president to address the Soviet public twice on nationwide television, and difficult to imagine Senator Edward Kennedy being sped by a Soviet secret police escort to a midnight rendezvous in Moscow with leaders of the Jewish immigration movement, as the vignettes about radio listening suggest. Détente gained millions of new listeners for Western radio broadcasts and gave them some glimmering out of the outside world. Soviet agreements on scientific, technical, and cultural exchanges with the West have markedly expanded the numbers of contacts between Soviet and Western specialists in recent years. The Soviet desire to maintain these contacts has also made the Kremlin sensitive to the outcry in the West against its campaign of vilification against dissident physicist Andrei Sakharov in the fall of 1973 and the crude police-state bulldozing of the mildly iconoclastic art exhibit a year later. To appease the West, the Kremlin called off the anti-Sakharov drive and permitted a substitute art show to be held. Later, as a humanitarian gesture, it allowed chess grandmaster Boris Spassky to marry a French woman, a cosmetic concession that had little effect on less celebrated individuals. Occasionally, détente had caused the Soviet leaders to lift some shrouds of secrecy in their campaign to woo France into greater independence from the Western alliance. They honored President de Gaulle in 1966 as the first Westerner permitted to visit the secret Soviet space launching site at Baikonur in Kazakhstan, and 9 years later it was the momentum of the Apollo-Soyuz mission, with the American plus the firm insistence of the American Apollo commander, Brig General Thomas Stafford, that forced the Soviets to open Baikonur to a few Americans, and even to let American officials and newsmen visit mission control outside Moscow as well. I remember on our visit to the cosmonauts' Star City thinking how much it reminded me of the old Kremlin, of Pskov, with walls not only surrounding the whole space complex, but walls within walls, shutting off still more secret areas that we could not enter. To compete with the openness of the American space program, the Russians had to let their own people for the first time see a live space launch and follow the progress of the Apollo-Soyuz mission as it proceeded. Again, after great delay, some American technical specialists were allowed to visit Siberian gas fields that Moscow wanted to develop with American credits, and after Washington was 3 times caught ill-prepared for the effects of sizable Soviet grain purchases, Moscow was willing in '75 to negotiate some long-term arrangements to cushion the shock of more big grain buying. But by far the most dramatic example of the human impact of détente was the willingness of the Kremlin, under strong pressure from the American Congress, to permit about 100,000 Soviet Jews to immigrate to Israel and the West in the first half of this decade. Under similar, though less publicized and controversial pressures from West Germany, several thousand ethnic Germans were also allowed to leave the country. Given the Kremlin's acute sensitivity to the proud image of the Soviet Union abroad as the promised land of socialism, permitting such an exodus was an unprecedented concession, a measure both of the severe disaffection among Soviet Jewry and of the intense desire of Leonid Brezhnev and his supporters within the leadership to secure the benefits of trade with the United States. You have no idea how important it is to have this third alternative, said a Jewish science writer who eventually emigrated. 10 years ago, if you could not stomach living under the Soviet system, you could, and he drew a finger across his throat. Now, thanks to the American policy of détente and the Soviet need for these little kernels of grain, there are three choices. Either as before, the finger at the throat, or you can struggle for some little bit of freedom because you know there exists a third alternative, to leave the country. It is important, however, to recognize where Moscow drew the limits. As this science writer pointed out, Soviet Jews were being allowed to immigrate as an exception to the normal Soviet restrictions on travel and immigration. Jews and ethnic Germans were being allowed to go, he said, but that did not mean this right was being granted permanently to them, or that the other 100-odd Soviet nationalities shared this privilege. The Jews are an exception, he emphasized. That is what you have to remember. Whenever our authorities have a difficult problem to deal with, and they must make concessions, they make exceptions, but they do not like to change the rules themselves. It was an important point, it seemed to me, in assessing the impact of other Soviet concessions to détente as well. Western outrage could spare Andrei Sakharov from jail or expulsion from the Academy of Sciences, but it had not protected many less well-known dissidents, nor had it won intellectual freedom for other Soviet scientists. Trials of anonymous dissenters continued steadily through détente. The Western outcry over the crude bulldozing of the modern art exhibit could shame Soviet authorities into allowing another special exhibit or two to take place, but it did not alter the fundamental controls on Soviet art. A bit of steam has to be let off, a gaunt young writer commented to me after the art show, but in ways that caused the least trouble. A bit of long hair, jazz, Western-style clothes for young people, a small art exhibition, but make no mistake, they are not about to sanction abstract art. No great change in cultural life is coming. The Jewish immigration has not changed. The fact that well over 90% or more of the 250 million Soviet citizens have never spent a day of their lives outside their country, and probably never will. The opening of the Baikonur Cosmodrome to American astronauts did not signal a shift to an open policy for the Soviet space program in general, but even the end of radio jamming was merely a return to the situation under Khrushchev, who had ended jamming in 1963 under a previous flowering of Soviet-American détente. Brezhnev had reimposed the jamming after the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and even after it was partially lifted in 1973, it still remained in force against Radio Liberty, the Western station most devoted to Soviet news. As détente wore on, moreover, some of my Soviet friends contended that Voice of America had toned down its political content to avoid ruffling the Kremlin's feathers. Others merely got bored with the preoccupation of Western stations with the West's own economic plight. We can read about that in our own press, a teacher commented dryly. We want the other news, the news we can't read in our own newspapers. Nor were the increased contacts with the West being allowed to get out of hand. Every outgoing scientific or cultural delegation was carefully screened, and so were Soviet participants for joint sessions in the Soviet Union. Getting into a meeting with the Americans is practically like getting access to a closed defense institute. One natural scientist complained, "Not surprisingly, those outside the privileged circle feel more isolated than ever. Hurry up and invite all our bosses to America," one Soviet scientist told an American who was arranging scientific exchanges. "Only after they have been there will there be space on our delegations for real practicing scientists. All these group contacts are monitored by informers, often just scientists who want to earn the privilege of still more trips to the West." In other words, the Brezhnev leadership was making certain not to repeat what it obviously regarded as the mistake made by Khrushchev, allowing some relaxation at home to accompany the easing of tensions abroad. Despite détente, vigilance against foreign ideological subversion remained a paramount concern in the Soviet press. At closed lectures, or even in little outdoor movies in public parks, Russians were told or shown how foreign tourists, scholars, or businessmen were trying to bring religious or political literature or other contraband into the Soviet Union to subvert the Russian people. Although the July '75 Conference on European Security and Cooperation did agree on exchanging observers to monitor large-scale military maneuvers in Europe, Moscow still resisted the principle of on-site inspection in arms agreements. It gained formal recognition of the de facto boundaries of Eastern Europe just as it had previously used the more relaxed atmosphere of détente to promote acceptance of East Germany, Cuba, and North Vietnam into the family of nations. The Russians accepted the conference proclamations about reunification of families and freer travel east and west, but Brezhnev openly warned the West that no one should try to dictate to other people, on the basis of foreign policy considerations of one kind or another, the manner in which they ought to manage their internal affairs. Politburo members like Yuri Andropov and Mikhail Suslov underscored the message that Moscow was not changing internally to accommodate the West by contending that Western concerns about human rights was no more than a cover for ideological sabotage. Georgy Arbatov, a leading spokesman on Soviet-American relations, contended that the Russians had far surpassed the West, and particularly the United States, in honoring humanitarian provisions of the Security Conference proclamation. In other words, the Kremlin was eager to push détente abroad, to take advantage of what Soviet Marxists are fond of calling the changing correlation of forces, but it sought to contain the impact of détente at home. Brezhnev was reaching out to the world abroad, but trying to hold it at bay at home. Thus far, he has been very successful. The notion persists in the West nonetheless, that trade leaps ideological barriers and will become the catalyst for the convergence of the two systems. In America particularly, there is the feeling that in the long run, the nexus of commerce will soften the Soviet police state and sow the seeds of eventual liberalization. The concept is not new. Back in 1922, British Prime Minister Lloyd George told Parliament that the sobering influence of trade would bring an end to the ferocity, the rapine, and the crudity of Bolshevism, surer than any other method. As a matter of fact, Britain, Germany, and the United States all traded quite heavily with Stalin's Russia in the 20s and 30s. The modern variant is that as the Soviet Union does more and more business with the capitalist West, some of capitalism's ways will rub off and the Kremlin will have to loosen up and move towards some kind of market socialism. As Soviet industrial managers are exposed to Western technology and the Russian public is exposed to Western lifestyles, they will see the strength of the Western system, so the theory goes, and this will feed the appetite for greater freedom and kindle grassroots pressures for fundamental changes in the Soviet Union. When I arrived in Moscow in 1971, I was intrigued by the possibility myself, but after 3 years of living there, I came home much more skeptical. In the first place, the Brezhnev coalition only turned to the West for new technology as an alternative to having to liberalize its own economy. When the domestic economic reforms of '65 failed, Brezhnev and Khrushchev decided that the shortcut to modernizing the Soviet system was to buy computers, petrochemical plants, and other high technology from the West and to plug these facilities ready-made into the Soviet system rather than granting the necessary freedom to Soviet managers, scientists, and engineers to develop such technology themselves. One of my Russian friends commented sarcastically that the Western technology would modernize the Soviet system so that we can have Stalinism with computers, a still centralized, controlled economy rather than a more flexible one. Over a long period of time, of course, this could change, but the Soviet rulers themselves do not seem uneasy at the prospect of exposure to Western businessmen. Any number of times I was told rather pointedly by Soviet officials or party journalists that they welcomed Western businessmen more than Western politicians, journalists, or writers, because, as one official said, they accept our system as it is without ideological objections. In other words, the Kremlin found that the profit motive could be trusted because Western businessmen were too busy doing business to be passing on the infectious virus of democracy. Nor did the Russians themselves have any ideological qualms about whom they dealt with. Among Americans, some of their favorite partners in trade were the biggest American defense contractors, but where East European countries have been willing to experiment with new forms of cooperative enterprises and various leaseback arrangements, the Russians have been quite firm about not altering the fundamental machinery of the Soviet economy. The basic objection, I believe, is less one of ideology than the refusal to permit the dispersal of power. When all is said and done, the Kremlin falls back on the tradition of holding all real power of decision at the center, for the Western notion that trade will somehow arouse irresistible grassroots pressure for greater freedom in Soviet life, rather than naively ignores Soviet and Russian history. It is a Western concept. Based on Western experience, in the past, the major changes in the Soviet system have not come about because of pressures from the Soviet public, but through decisions from on high. It was Stalin who initiated the industrial 5-year plans in 1928 and ordered collectivization of agriculture. Khrushchev in '56, who unmasked Stalin, later shook up the party structure and imposed regional economic management on the country, and the Brezhnev-Khrushchev leadership, which promulgated the half-hearted and ill-fated economic reforms of '65. Détente itself was a policy launched by the leadership for its own purposes, and it has been carefully controlled by the leadership ever since. What little change it has brought has been kept in check within parameters that precluded fundamental reforms. What has been at work is a process of grafting on, or adapting techniques from the West, or making exceptions and piecemeal adjustments, but not of radical transformation. Western technicians may now be allowed to look at some gas and oil fields in Siberia to encourage Western investment, but they are kept away from scores of other industrial sites to which their business would logically take them. IBM may be asked to install computerized typesetting for Pravda and Izvestia, and computerized control system for the Kama River truck plant, but it is required to house most of its specialists in Western Europe and fly them periodically into the Soviet Union to do their jobs, because Moscow will not grant visas for more than 2 IBM men to live in the country at one time. Security and control of contacts take precedence over convenience or efficiency. The result is that so far one cannot see any germ which has been taken in either through nuclear standoff, cultural exchange, or broadened trade, all loosely lumped together as detente, that has flowered on its own and is visibly beginning to transform the Soviet system. For the Kremlin has proven itself remarkably adept at insulating its population from a contagion of free ideas from the West. Far more is at work, however, than the Soviet system of controls, for detente confronts the accumulated weight of Russian history, the built-in inertia and attitudes of centuries. Those in the West, captivated by the notion of convergence, often lose sight of the essential Russianness of Russia today. We are aware that Russia is a very old nation, but nonetheless we are quick to forget its past when we think about its present and its future. It would be foolish, of course, to maintain that nothing was changed by the Bolshevik Revolution, which was one of the cataclysmic events of this century. Royalty and the old aristocracy were swept away, and later, under Stalin, an entire continental economy was transformed. The rhetoric of public life today is unambiguously communist, yet the longer I stayed in Moscow, the less impressed I was by how communist the country was, and the more I thought how Russian it was, rather than alter the centralized authoritarian system of rule inherited from the czars. The communists have strengthened it, made it more pervasive and efficient. Their dramatic, built-from-scratch construction projects were not entirely new departures, but modern variations on Peter the Great's brutal construction of St. Petersburg. The violent social upheavals of the first 2 decades of Soviet rule wrought great changes, but now a new ruling class has emerged, as jealous of its power and privilege as the czarist nobility. Paradoxically, perhaps Russia has seemed gradually to be returning to many of its old ways. The Cold War legacy, as well as Moscow's economic isolationism during the post-war period, has mistakenly led many Americans to assume, for example, that trade with the West is a new game for the Russians, but it is actually striking how much Leonid Brezhnev is pursuing a path and a policy used by his czarist predecessors, and how little authoritarian rule in Russia through the centuries has been affected by its episodic contacts with the West. For buying high technology from the West in exchange for Russian raw materials is a pattern of Russian commerce that predates the discovery of America. 500 years ago, Ivan the Great, the Grand Prince of Muscovy, hired Italian architects and engineers to build 2 of the great Kremlin cathedrals, a palace and the Kremlin walls and towers, much as today's Kremlin rulers are hiring Western firms to construct truck and car factories, metal foundries, and petrochemical plants. Other Italians ran the imperial mint and managed the casting of cannons for the Grand Prince, while Greek masters were imported to teach art. The next Tsar, Ivan the Terrible, persuaded some Englishmen to set up the first Russian printing press, used German military engineers to help him mount the siege of Kazan against the Tatars in 1552, and had the Dutch set up an ironworks to support the armaments industry, yet he was one of the bloodiest despots in all Russian history at the turn of the 18th century. Peter the Great conducted a Western technology hunt on an even grander scale. Today, some Russians jokingly call Brezhnev a modern Peter, bringing to Russia thousands of foreign craftsmen in all fields and recruiting hundreds of Swedes and Germans to work in his civil service because he admired their efficiency, self-discipline, and honesty. He too ruled with an iron hand. Some of the very practices that Westerners attribute today to the obsessive secrecy and xenophobia of the communist police state developed under the Tsars. In those days, too, the Russians imposed ideological controls on trade and segregated foreign merchants from the local population. Like the Communist Party today, the Russian Orthodox Church in the 15th century was on guard against alien heresies. Books brought along by Western traders were confiscated by the customs agent of the Grand Prince, stirred to action by a vigilant and defensive church, just as Soviet customs agents today take away political literature, skin magazines, or certain rock records from indiscreet Western travelers. Then as now, resident foreigners were shunted off into isolated ghettos apart from the mass of Russians with whom they had little contact. The most important of these enclaves, called Kitagorod, was located outside the Kremlin walls, where now stands the Rossaya Hotel, one of the lodgings most frequented by foreign businessmen and Western delegations today. Russian history even contains a precedent for Leonid Brezhnev's efforts to sweeten the climate for trade with America by letting larger numbers of Soviet Jews immigrate. Around 1600, Tsar Boris Godunov released a number of German merchants captured during the Battle of Novgorod in a deliberate ploy to cajole the German princedoms into commerce, not only in its patterns of trade but also in its political system. The Soviet state owes a debt to the traditions of Tsarist Russia, traditions that today constitute a powerful impediment to change. The great celebrations of communist holidays, when the leadership assembles on the Lenin Mausoleum and throngs of people march through Red Square in a ritual declaration of fealty, evoke Tolstoy's rich descriptions of the religious processions through Red Square by the masses humbly parading their homage before the Tsar. Under communism, the masses carry aloft the portraits of the party Politburo members. Under the Tsars, they carried huge religious icons. The censorship of poets like Pushkin, the Siberian exile Dostoevsky, the illegal publication in the West of later works by Tolstoy, all foreshadowed Soviet repression of free-thinking writers today, in much the same way that Khrushchev and Brezhnev snuffed out incipient revolts in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The Tsars crushed rebellions in Hungary and Poland in the 19th century. Then as now, the rulers were supported by a service class of nobility who were rewarded for service in the state with grants of land and other privileges, translated today into the system of special stores, hospitals, rest homes, dacha communities for the Soviet elite. Then, as now, the state supported the imperial ballet to project the image of cultured elegance at home and abroad. Perhaps more fundamental than these abiding arrangements and rituals of public life is the deep-seated influence of history on Russian character and institutions, the centralized concentration of power, the fetish of rank, the xenophobia of simple people, the futile carping of alienated intelligentsia, the passionate attachment of the Russians to Mother Russia, the habitual submission of the masses to the supreme leader, and their unquestioned acceptance of the yawning gulf between the ruler and the ruled. The longer I lived in Soviet Russia, the more Russian it seemed to me, and hence the less likely to undergo fundamental change. Whenever I would see signs of change, Russian intellectuals would disabuse me. Gradually, it came through to me that Russians, unlike Westerners, do not take it for granted that Russian dictatorship must inevitably evolve into democracy, for they know its power and its permanence. They recognize its ability to adapt without surrendering its essence. They find comfort in the stability and order that it provides, fearing what seems to them the chaotic turbulence of Western liberal democracies. Most of them do not want democracy for Russia. Even those intellectuals who long for it will say that their society is not ready for the give and take, the political tolerance and compromise, the self-restraint that democracy requires. Even they draw back from it or say that it must take generations to evolve. Perhaps one reason that Westerners do not grasp such feelings and so readily assume that Russians are like us is that Russian life offers no obvious tourist exotica. Women in saris or kimonos, figures of Buddha in temples, camels on the desert, to remind the outsider that here is alien culture, one which did not pass through the Renaissance, Reformation, and the era of constitutional liberalism, which shaped the West, but here is a culture that absorbed Eastern Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium, endured Mongol conquest and rule, and then developed through centuries of Tsarist absolutism, with intermittent periods of opening toward the West, followed by withdrawal into continental isolation. That pattern was repeated again and again. The forays into the West brought some changes, but did not fundamentally dilute the strong authoritarian strain in the Russian body politic in any lasting way. If anything, Western innovations were simply used to reinforce Russian methods. Peter the Great could win the reputation as Russia's greatest westernizer, and yet he also laid the foundations of the modern police state and was ruthless in his intolerance and dissent and his bloody punishment of wayward nobility. Catherine the Great could begin her détente with the West in fascination with Voltaire and the French encyclopedist, and end it by imposing controls to stamp out the infection of liberal French ideas in her court. In short, there often have been unsettling influences from the West, but Russia's rulers have coped with them over time. Brezhnev's tactics today may differ slightly, but his strategy is the same as that of the Tsars, to extract the best technology from the West without having to absorb the critical caste of mind or the way of life that produced it, as did the Tsars before him. Brezhnev takes a risk, but so far there is no visible reason to expect that the ancient patterns of Russian life will be fundamentally altered. Often the powerful sense of continuity with the Russian past comes through in funny little ways. Right after Nixon's first visit to Moscow in '72, Anne and I took a car trip to Yaroslavl to see the Russian countryside in summertime. About halfway we stopped at a Soviet service station for gasoline. The first time I had ever gassed up in a Soviet car on the highway, and I was intrigued by the routine. First, I had to pick my pump, guess how many liters of gas I needed, and inform a chubby girl in the office. Then I paid her in advance with special coupons, and she dialed me the desired number of liters on a console in the office. Finally, I went back to pump my own gas. It was strictly do-it-yourself. To me, it was a mildly comic scene to see everyone pumping his own gas, the bread man, two motorcyclists, truck drivers servicing massive vehicles, and a few people bent over Soviet compacts like the Moskovich or the Zaporozhets. That station was a scene of great disorder. People wheeled up to a pump or backed into a pump from any possible direction and parked at any angle that suited them. It was a minor mayhem getting in and out, and it struck me as a great scene for pictures. I had only shot about 4 or 5 when I was confronted by a bull-necked Russian in shirt sleeves and a hat who was waving his arms in front of my camera and angrily bellowing at me. "Show me your documents," he demanded. With his fleshy face, ample stomach, and baggy pants, he looked the epitome of the Russian worker, one step off the collective farm. Since I knew of nothing in the Soviet regulations that forbade photographing a gasoline station, and since he appeared to be no more than an overzealous Soviet citizen, of whom there are many, I tried to ignore him. "It's all right," I said soothingly. "Excuse me." I sidestepped him so that I could shoot pictures in another direction. Again he loomed in front of me and demanded my documents, a standard Soviet method of intimidation. "Who are you?" I asked. "Show me your documents," he repeated. By now he was fairly exercised, evidently because I had not immediately succumbed. We argued back and forth. I half expected a crowd to reinforce him, but the other motorists went on gassing up. They stared but did not take part. It turned out that my burly friend was the manager of the service station. I explained to him that I was an American correspondent, which he undoubtedly knew already from the special coded license plates on the car, and that I had just finished writing stories about the meetings between Nixon and Brezhnev, and was taking my wife on a trip. "Which way are you going?" he demanded suspiciously. "I'm going to call the police." I said we were driving toward Yaroslavl, and trying to humor him, I asked whether he had seen Nixon and Brezhnev on television. Yes, he had seen it all. Was he happy about the taunt? I asked. Yes, of course. He wanted peace between our peoples, but it was forbidden to take photographs. Then I said that since he was interested in peace, he must have read the arms agreements. Yes, of course he had, and I asked whether he had noticed that each side had agreed to let the other side fly Sputniks over its territory to take pictures of its missiles so that there would be no danger of surprise attack. He looked puzzled, but after a couple of minutes he seemed to absorb the idea that Russian Sputniks were taking pictures of American rockets, and American Sputniks were taking pictures of Soviet rockets from the sky. "Well," I said finally, "if our leaders can be so friendly and agree on those Sputniks taking pictures of missiles, there can't be anything wrong with taking pictures of a gas station, can there?" He frowned with peasant wariness. "It's forbidden," he fumed, his former indignation returning. He wagged an angry finger at my camera, It's forbidden. I'm going to call the police to come after you." And he stormed off to telephone them. I took a couple of last snapshots and drove off. The police never troubled us, but I still muttered at what I took to be the exaggerated communist vigilance of this gas station manager, keeping watch against a wandering imperialist. Anne, who was then reading Henry Troyat's biography of Tolstoy, recalled the episode after his death when Tolstoy's body was lying in a provincial railroad station. Some Russian photographers wanted to take pictures of the great man's body, but the station master, would not permit any photography on his premise. He was suspicious of photography and vaguely aware of rules against it. Without special permission from St. Petersburg, he was adamantly opposed to any photography in his station. "So you see," said Anne, "it's nothing new. It was the same under the Tsars. They are the same people."